Ishmael. I created Vanguard for the Click Team PixelCRAM 2025 Game Jam. And we're going to go through quickly talk about the game and my submission and how I got here. So Vanguard was heavily inspired by early pseudo 3D games from as far back as NES and Atari. I had always been fascinated with these early attempts to mimic a 3D environment with such limited hardware capabilities, and with PixelCRAM's restrictions, it sounded like a perfect way to kind of experiment myself and see how far we can go with some of the techniques that they use, plus some modern tools added in there. Some of the inspirations for it were games like Battlezone from Atari, Spitfire Attack. Then on the NES, there was Top Gun, as well as there's a game called Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam Hot Scramble. And all these games really try to create a first-person environment, especially with the last one, since that was actually a mech-related game as well. So in that vein, let's go look at the code. So what really my game boils down to is really a lot of just basic math, as well as just some pretty smart uses with the sprites and how they're constructed, and I'll quickly show you both of those. Well, basically what's going on here, we have your cockpit, and the cockpit is basically where we store all the variables for the game. But the main important ones here I'm going to talk about is Z position, the Z POS. Every enemy, every single object that moves, or at least looks like it moves in a three-dimensional space, has this Z position, and the Z position is how we'll be using to replicate that perspective. And basically how it works is these values will be, in general, was from 0 to 100, with 100 being the furthest possible and 0 being the player's position, since the player is first person. And the values can go into the negatives as well, and usually when they drop into negatives, we just remove them from the field because you're past. But there's an extra layer on top of that where, because the mech is always moving forward, we need to have the ability to mech to also close that distance. So it's actually a mathematical. So what we have here, this is basically the math that controls most of the perspective mimicking here. We basically use the cockpit as the center point. So what we do is we take the Z position of any enemies and environment objects, then we subtract the Z position of the player, which is the cockpit. Then we take that amount and we subtract that from 100 itself, because we want to flip. Because basically things need to be getting bigger as they come close to it, not getting smaller, so we need to flip that. And then on top of that, we then divide that by 100 to make a float value, which will then be used to scale. And that's what we set the scale to. This adding 0.001 is just to force it to be a float, so this equation doesn't error out. So we're recording here, and as you see here, the tank is getting closer as we walk, even though they only move in a straight line. And I can even speed up. You can see that how quickly we pass by the tanks. I have a few little counters here so you can see what's going on. The one over my target shows the distance. So that is the number that is calculated with that equation. So you can see how close I am. It gets closer as time progresses. All the way out on the left-hand side is a counter that shows the Z position of the cockpit. So basically this is a player position in this pseudo space. Now the number right in the middle, this is our X position, and since this is what we use to mimic this kind of 180 turning, is actually nothing's actually physically moving on the scene itself. Everything is the background, the enemies, the objects, they're all moving, and the cockpit is stationary. But it's all moving based on this value here. So when you drop, being a 0 is directly in the middle, and then dropping to -70, and then +70 on this side will determine which way you're angled. Now for collisions, as you see here, there is a little green box at the bottom of my cockpit that detects collisions with an object, and then it compares that with the Z position of that object. Once it becomes within a certain parameter, it's considered to be blocked, as we see here, and my mech is no longer moving forward because the building's in the way. This little, you're probably wondering what this little diamond in the middle is. This is basically the spawner for our enemies. Since our environment here isn't actually static, I'm static, we needed something to also move with the environment to properly place enemies down. And that's what you see here. Typically is hidden in the actual game, so is the green box below. As you see here, I'm not actually calculating perspective, so it does get a little wonky, but that's honestly not really was in the scope of this project. I'm not trying to create a 3D environment, I'm just trying to create the feel of one. Something else I needed to do, so our enemies as well as these tanks here, they move left to right. However, if we keep their movement speed static, you have this weird effect where the tank will be moving much faster farther away, but then come near standstill up close. So we actually need to modify that speed, and that's why we have this calculation over here. Once again, we're using, since 100 is kind of considered the base, and I deliberately chose that to make these calculations much easier. All we're doing is once again getting the difference between the tank in this case and the cockpit. Then we're going to subtract that from 100 because once again we need to invert that value. We want the tank moving faster as it gets closer, not slower. And then we're going to divide the whole thing by 5. Honestly, that division was just more done for just trial and error just to see how fast I want the tank to move. That really can easily be changed to mimic anything. It's not that set. Then I'll bring it up in the game here. Let's see if we can find a tank somewhere. Use an aircraft. Of course, one's not going to spawn until... There it is. As you see, it's moving slightly faster as it gets closer to us. So now another thing you probably notice is the gun. So I really wanted to mimic a mech style movement, so instead of doing what traditional first person shooters do, where the weapon is just kind of a locked position on the screen and you just rotate the screen, instead you have more or less control of moving the right arm of the mech, and it moves independently from the mech itself. You don't actually control the mech itself, but instead when the cursor goes closer to the right or left side of the screen, that's when we start updating the positions of the environment and the objects in that environment. And then once you get to the end within certain parameters and you let go of the button, it would then snap back to a position where it no longer affects the direction. And as you see here too, the right arm does kind of scale vertically to match with target. So basically, as the target is over that object, and what it does is let's bring that up here really quick. In the sprite of the tank, if you notice, the hotspot here is well above the tank, and this is going to be your center point for as the tank scales. Is going to scale based on that as the origin point, and that kind of properly positions it on the screen as it gets closer. So because you're essentially much taller than this object, it will then show closer to the bottom of the screen without having additional code. Now the reason I brought this up is traditionally when you lock things on a position, it's based on the position value, but it won't work in this case because then you always be aiming over the object instead of at it. So what I then did is with the action point, we set the action point directly over where the actual sprite is, and this is the point that we would then connect in the code. So we go over here. So you see you're setting the Y position to the Y action point. That's simply what we do to lock it. And when we have bigger objects, such as, let's bring up a building, you can see there the hotspot is closer. This one here is towards the top, but it's still well within the actual object itself. But then we still set the action point to be the center point. Now this action point is also where the enemy projectiles spawn from. They may not always align properly, but with the relative speed of the combat and small screen size, it's not too noticeable. There's another part here we need to talk about, and that's the actual actions of the mech. When you press the control button, depending on what you have selected, let me get unstuck here. It does its traditional, the combat animations. So how these objects are calculated are similar, but instead of it being based on the cockpit, the mech itself, what we do with these objects is we have a variable called origin position. So when they are created during the action, we then set that origin to a point. In this case, it's actually set to just a few, I think it's just -5 from the Z position of the cockpit, or +5 actually, not -5, +5. We set that origin point, and then we'll set the Z position to +5, so that way it would render that sprite as if it's close, and then all we do is add to that Z value. And when the Z position, the current Z position of that object reaches over the 100, it's a difference of over 100, then we remove it from the screen, and that basically mimics that whole range. And then for detecting collisions, all we need to do is just check to see if the sprite's overlapping a target, and then we need to just check the Z position of that target and then the Z position of the object. And just to kind of give a little bit of buffer room, we do +5, -5, just to kind of simulate a bit of depth in there. And then we just switch it to the destroy action, and then I'll put the destroy animation, and it would automatically scale because it's already scaling the sprite based on that Z position. It's really not super complicated. Alright, we're playing the final version of the game. I was playing just an earlier version, but I wanted to talk about a couple extra things. So we have some of these indicators I wanted to explain. This one little box directly in front. So as you notice, the actual background of the scene doesn't actually animate. Because it's relatively small size, I didn't really bother to animate that. So instead, I'm using these trees over here, and you can see it's like a forest object, not just a single tree. I'm using those. I'm also using this box here to kind of emulate that there's movement, to kind of simulate going forward. And when you do speed up, it does scale with it, so it really brings that out. And it's kind of like a little nifty way to get around, because some of those games that I mentioned earlier as references typically use like a checkered or straight pattern on the ground. And while that is very effective at simulating movement going forward, it definitely doesn't emulate what actual ground looks like, and definitely takes away from that simulation experience. So I really wanted to try to keep the ground looking like ground. And this is kind of one of those little advantages that the space requirement for this jam that made this game really possible, because I don't think this would have emulated as well in a much higher resolution. The other thing I want to just briefly mention is this radar on the top of the screen. It's a horizontal bar, and basically all the red dots, these are all scaling to objects and their X positions in relative to that diamond in the middle of the map. And it shows up here. And basically the little blue boxes is the limits of how far you can rotate, as you see. And the green is your current viewport. So we scale that. As you see, like that red dot is in the center. Is this red dot? There's something coming up behind me. You can vaguely see a tank. See it coming up from behind. Those are the two inside my view. Honestly, this was really more or less just trial and error. I didn't really have my math together to get this correct. But it works. It gets the job done. Oh yeah, that. If you notice that red box, that is what it used to indicate that you can't move forward. There's something blocking you. See if I can find a structure. Yes. So let's talk about the melee combat. It's basically once you reach the area that you can no longer progress, and there's a bit of buffer beforehand too. I think it's about 20. Your weapon switches to the melee, which you saw there. You can melee structures, and you can even melee the aircraft. Oh, speaking of which. And really that's done in the exact same calculation that I do to detect if the structure is in the way. There's nothing too different with that. There's really not much more to explain about this. I don't think. Isn't fairly self-explanatory. I don't know if you noticed that there are these little buggies that, excuse me, that come up behind. And those are simply done by when you spawn the object, I set its Z value to the cockpit Z position, and then I subtract 10, and that kind of emulates it coming back from behind. And all we need to do then is to just simply add to that position value at a steady rate, and it kind of gives that going off into the distance.